Halloween started just like every other year. I had a big bowl of candy ready, and the doorbell rang non-stop for the first few hours. Kids in costumes came in droves, princesses, superheroes, little monsters, all with eager smiles and bags open wide. It was fun, in the beginning. But as the night dragged on, the number of trick-or-treaters dwindled. By 9 p.m., it was mostly teenagers, too old to care about costumes, but still young enough to want free candy. I gave out the last few pieces, glancing down the street where the lights from other houses were slowly going dark. Halloween was coming to an end. By 10:30, I hadn't seen anyone for a while, so I decided to call it a night. I turned off the porch light. Everyone knows that means no more candy, and locked the front door. With a sigh of relief, I collapsed onto the couch, flipping through the channels until I landed on an old horror movie. The night was over and I was ready to fall asleep to the sound of cheesy jump scares. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A knock at the door. I sat up, confused. It was past 11 p.m. No one should have been out trick-or-treating that late, especially not with all the lights off. Figuring it was probably some teenager trying to pull a prank, I got up and went to the door. When I looked through the peephole, though, there was no one there. Weird. I waited a moment longer just in case, but the street was empty. The wind rustled through the trees and I could see the glow of distant streetlights through the window, but not a single person in sight. Shrugging, I turned back to the couch, ready to forget about it. But the knock came again. This time, louder. I froze. Something about it felt wrong. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I didn't open it. Instead, I peered through the peephole again, expecting to see nothing. But there was someone there this time, or rather, something. An eye, a bloodshot, wide-open eye staring directly at me through the peephole. It was so close that all I could see was the iris, a pale, sickly blue, unblinking and so unnervingly still that it sent a chill up my spine. Whoever it was, they were pressed against the door as close as they could possibly get. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. What the heck was that? Another knock, more insistent this time, followed by a raspy voice. Trick or treat. The words scraped through the air, barely above a whisper. But it was the kind of voice that crawled under your skin. Then I heard it, the sound of something scratching against the door, slow and deliberate, like nails scraping across wood. I didn't dare move. The scratching continued, growing louder, almost frantic now, as if whoever was outside was clawing to get in. My breath caught in my throat and I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the door as the knocking returned, louder, more urgent. Trick or treat, the voice rasped again, followed by more scraping, this time at the door frame, like they were testing it, trying to find a way in. I wanted to run, to hide, but my feet wouldn't move. I glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. Too late for anyone to be out, too late for this to be a joke. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The scratching stopped. The voice fell silent. I stood there, frozen, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like hours, I slowly crept back to the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I pressed my eye to the peephole one more time, dreading what I might see, but the porch was empty. Relief flooded through me, and I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it really had been just a prank, some kid trying to scare me. But as I turned to head back to the couch, a final knock echoed through the house, louder than ever. This time, it wasn't from the door. It was from the window. I stopped dead in my tracks, cold fear gripping my chest. The blinds hung down, closed, but the knock had come from right behind them. My hands trembled as I approached the window, the air in the room seeming to grow heavier with each step. I reached out, hesitating, not wanting to know what was on the other side, but too terrified not to check. With a slow, shaky breath, I gripped the edge of the blinds and lifted them just enough to peek through. And there it was, the same eye, bloodshot, wide, and impossibly close, staring back at me with that same unnerving stillness. But now I could see more. A pale, gaunt face pressed against the glass, its skin stretched too tight, lips twisted in a crooked, unnatural grin. I yanked the blinds shut and stumbled back, heart pounding, breath coming in shallow gasps. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. When the operator picked up, I barely managed to get the words out. "Someone's at my window," I whispered. "They won't leave. Please send someone." The minutes that followed felt like hours. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees, listening, waiting. The knocking had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. When the police finally arrived, I rushed to the door and unlocked it, throwing it open. 2 officers stood on my porch, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I tried to explain, but my words came out in a frantic jumble. "There was someone here," I said, pointing to the window. "I saw their eye. They were knocking." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, but nodded. "Let's take a look," one of them said, stepping forward. They checked the yard, the window, the entire perimeter of the house, but found no one, not a single sign that anyone had been there. But when they examined the front door, one of the officers frowned, shining his flashlight along the frame. "Take a look at this," he said, pointing to the wood. I stepped closer and my heart sank. Long, deep scratches ran along the door, 3, maybe 4 of them, claw marks, as if something or someone had tried to tear their way inside. The marks were too deep for fingernails. They looked like claws. The officers exchanged another glance, this one less skeptical, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. They didn't say much after that, just gave me a warning to keep my doors and windows locked and promised to patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. But as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. And I knew deep down, this wasn't over. Every Halloween, the house at the end of Granger Street stood like a challenge, daring anyone brave or foolish enough to approach. Its front door was notorious for never opening, not for decades, but no one ever got close enough to knock, not with the tunnel of twisted trees that lined the path, branches forming a canopy so dense it swallowed the light and made the world feel claustrophobic. This year, though, I had to make it to the door. I wasn't going to back out like the rest of the kids, not with Sarah here. Sarah wasn't like the others. She wasn't scared of anything, or at least she didn't let it show. And when the group started talking about Granger Street and who would be brave enough to knock, I jumped in before I could think better of it. Anything to impress her. "I'll go," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Sarah looked at me with a raised eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "You serious? No one's ever made it to the door." "I'm not scared," I lied, my stomach already tightening into knots. She smiled, a challenge flashing in her eyes. "Let's see." And that's how I found myself standing at the rusted iron gate, staring down the long, crooked path toward the house. The group hung back, whispering, but Sarah stood closer, watching me, waiting to see if I'd actually go through with it. My heart pounded as I took my first step onto the cracked stones. The moment I crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air got colder, heavier, like the house was exhaling an icy breath. The trees above swayed slightly, their branches creaking, as if reacting to my presence. I could feel the shadows in the tunnel press in closer, the darkness becoming almost tangible. I wasn't going to stop now, though, not with Sarah watching. I kept walking, my feet crunching over dried leaves as I moved deeper under the canopy. Halfway there, I glanced back. Sarah was still there, arms crossed, her eyes on me. I was doing this for her, and maybe for myself too. But then I saw it. The door. It was open. Just a crack. Not enough for someone to be standing there, but enough to suggest someone or something was waiting for me. A faint, warm light flickered from inside, casting long shadows across the porch. The house almost felt alive, like it was aware of me standing there. My breath hitched, and I froze for a moment. It was Halloween. Maybe this was all some elaborate trick. Maybe the stories about the house were just stories. But I could feel it, the pull of the door inviting me closer. I hesitated for a second, then did what anyone would do in my place. "Trick or treat," I called out, my voice cracking slightly, but I forced it to stay steady. The door creaked wider in response, just enough for me to see deeper inside, but there was no one there, just darkness. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood there waiting, but nothing happened. The house didn't respond. There was only silence, and that faint glow from somewhere deep inside, beckoning. I stepped back, a knot of unease twisting in my gut. The house was trying to lure me in, and for a second, I thought about it. Just one step. What if Sarah actually saw me go inside? But no, this was wrong. I wasn't stupid enough to fall for it. With a shaky breath, I turned and walked back down the path, faster this time. The trees groaned above me, their branches seeming to reach for me, but I kept my eyes ahead, focusing on the gate. I wasn't going to look back. When I reached the street, Sarah was there, still smiling, but now there was something else in her eyes. Maybe it was surprise, maybe respect. "So, did you knock?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, I said trick or treat though." Sarah chuckled softly. "Did it answer?" I shrugged, trying to hide the unease still twisting in my chest. "No, but it wanted me to go in." Her smirk faded a little, and she glanced back toward the house. "Yeah," she said quietly. "That's what it does." We stood there for a moment, the cold wind blowing through the branches of the trees behind us. Whatever was in that house, it was still waiting, and I wasn't going to be the one to find out why. Halloween night in our town always felt different, more dangerous, more alive than it should be. It wasn't just the costumes or the decorations. It was something in the air, something dark and ancient that clung to the cold breeze like a warning. The parents and grandparents in town had their stories, ones they'd grown up with, passed down through generations. Every year around this time they'd talk about the Lantern Man. As kids, we'd heard it whispered, half serious, around dinner tables and bonfires. But no matter how much we laughed it off, the stories always sent a chill down your spine. The legend went like this. Every few years, on Halloween night, a man carrying an old, flickering lantern would walk the streets just after dusk. No one knew who he was or why he came, but if you saw him, you weren't supposed to look into his eyes. The moment you did, he'd start following you. And if he made it to your door, you couldn't speak, not a word. If you invited him in, even by accident, you'd vanish without a trace by morning. Those who disappeared left no sign of struggle. Their houses stayed undisturbed, like they'd simply been plucked from existence. No one ever found them, but everyone in town knew what happened. The Lantern Man had taken them. The last time anyone claimed to see him was decades ago, but this year the rumors started up again, as always. Some of the old folks swore he was due for a visit. I didn't believe any of it. That is, until the night he showed up. I was trick-or-treating with Emily and Ben. They're my cousins. We'd been going house to house, filling our bags with candy as the wind tugged at our costumes, and the sky darkened to an inky black. The streets were packed with kids, the usual Halloween chaos. But something felt off that night. The breeze was sharper, the shadows a little darker. We were on our way back when Emily froze mid-step. "Did you see that?" she whispered. We all stopped and followed her gaze. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the familiar row of houses with their glowing jack-o'-lanterns. But then I spotted him, a figure standing under the street lamp at the far end of the block. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow, and in his hand, an old lantern swayed back and forth. The light inside was faint, flickering in the wind, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. "That's just some guy," I said, trying to brush it off. "Probably just some dad in a costume." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Emily swallowed hard. "It's him, the lantern man." I wanted to laugh at her, tell her she was being ridiculous, but my mouth went dry. We all stood frozen, watching as the man took a slow, deliberate step forward. His lantern swung wide, the dim light flickering against the pavement. "We need to go," Ben muttered. None of us moved. The man took another step. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of metal squeaking, his lantern swinging in the breeze. That sound, it was unmistakable, soft, eerie, like a rusty gate barely hanging onto its hinges. The squeaking of the lantern grew louder as he moved closer, the rhythmic clinking echoing down the street. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Emily's arm. We bolted, sprinting towards Ben's house, the echo of the lantern's squeak chasing us. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the soft thud of footsteps following us and the creak of the lantern, always that creak growing louder, closer. We reached Ben's house and threw ourselves through the door, slamming it shut behind us. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and candles, and the silence was so complete, it felt like the world had stopped. "What do we do?" Ben's voice trembled as he spoke. "If he saw us, he'll follow us here. That's what happens, right?" I tried to catch my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We don't talk to him. We stay quiet, and he can't get in. That's how the story goes." "But what if he—" Emily started, her voice trembling, but before she could finish, there was a knock. Soft at first, then louder. 3 deliberate knocks. We froze. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the silence stretching out, heavy and suffocating. Another lock. Louder this time. More insistent. The squeak of the lantern faint as it swung gently in the wind, and through the bottom of the door we saw the faint, flickering glow of the lantern's light. It cast strange shadows across the floor, twisting and bending like they had a life of their own. Then his voice. "Trick or treat." The words crawled through the door, soft but heavy, like they carried a weight I didn't want to understand. My throat tightened and I could barely breathe. I knew we couldn't say anything, not a word. If we did... Another knock. The doorknob rattled slightly, but the door didn't open. The lantern squeaked again, the sound of the chain growing louder, as if the lantern man was leaning closer to the door. "Trick or treat." Emily squeezed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. None of us moved, not even to breathe. The house was silent, except for the sound of the lantern swinging in the wind and the steady creak that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The light beneath the door flickered once more and faded. The squeaking of the lantern grew distant. Footsteps echoed softly as the lantern man walked away, the sound of his boots scraping against the pavement, disappearing into the night. We stayed where we were, waiting in silence, too scared to move or even speak. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the windows that we dared to breathe again. The lantern man had come and gone. But next Halloween, I'd make sure to stay far from the streets when the sun set, because no matter how many times he comes back, I know the lantern man never leaves empty-handed. All it takes is one word.